So the Evergrande Group really did their name justice, because while in 2020 they were only number 5 on the top 10 list of most indebted companies, in 2021 they blasted straight to the number 1 spot with well over $300 billion worth of corporate debt. Evergrande created this additional $200 billion of debt in just 1 year, and now they are in deep shit. Because as a major international company, you can pretty much borrow as much as you like, but you do have to pay interest on all of those loans, and it is this little detail that is now collapsing the entire Chinese real estate market. So congratulations, Bill Wang, you are no longer the biggest financial idiot of 2021. This title now goes to the entire executive team of the Evergrande Group. So drop a like if you think that creating $300 billion worth of debt on just $335 billion worth of assets is just stupid. Now normally corporate debt itself is not a problem or a bad thing, it's actually a very common way of financing a growing company, without having to share it with greedy investors that try to get their grummy little paws all over your business. All you have to do is manage this debt properly. Borrowing for instance $1 million from the bank to buy a business that's bringing in $250,000 in profit each year is perfectly fine. You just pay the 2 to 6% interest on the outstanding loan balance and pay back 10% of the principal each year for a 10-year loan. If you do this a couple times, you'll be making more and more money every single year. This is simply buying revenue streams, and it's actually how most companies grow at phenomenal speed. But that's not exactly what the Evergrande Group did. No, these geniuses really push the limits of what you can do with corporate debt. Because don't forget, Evergrande was only created in 1996, when it was just a tiny company called Hangda, and it grew into this $335 billion behemoth in just 25 years. Which might sound a bit slow if you're used to Facebook and Tesla speed, but for normal companies in traditional industries, this is actually insanely fast. So now the question becomes, how in the world did we, well, not you and me of course, but the 1.4 billion people in China get here? Was there really no oversight by the regulators to prevent all of this? Or did the CEO pull off some magic banking tricks? Well, the answer to this is actually a little of both. You see, the regulators in China have actually been asleep for quite some time now, and they let the real estate companies borrow just a shitload of money. And when I say a shitload, I do mean a shitload. We're talking about trillions of dollars in debt here, of which a major part is basically junk debt, and they allowed this because it was fueling the growth in China. However, all of this growth was financed solely by the excessive borrowing, and that is not without risk. In 2020, Beijing finally started to get worried that things might be spiraling out of control in the real estate market, and this caused them to say, okay, you guys have to reduce your debt exposure quickly, and from now on you're no longer allowed to increase your debt by more than 15% per year. In addition to this, they also launched the 3 Red Lines campaign, which consisted of not allowing a company's financial ratio to get past a certain value. Now, without getting too technical here, it basically comes down to if you violate any of these 3 values, your debt is no longer allowed to increase by 15%. And if you violate all 3, you are no longer allowed to borrow anything. The only problem with the Red Line campaign was that by this time Evergrande had already amassed well over $100 billion in debt, was already violating 2 out of the 3 ratios, and it turned out that only 6.3% of all real estate developers could even comply with these red lines. So great job on the quick response, Chinese regulators, you guys really prevented a massive fuck up. Anyways, by now it was clear that Evergrande had major struggles with their cash to short-term debt ratio, also known as not paying their bills, but the CEO of Evergrande really did not give a shit about this because he was not worried about increasing his debt by 15 or 10%. No, this genius was focused on the big picture, total destruction of the real estate market. And so he did, because even though he was already in violation of 2 of the red lines by the end of 2020, he still managed to take the debt from around $120 billion to well over $305 billion. Now I'm gonna take a wild guess here and say that this increase is a bit more than 15%. And voila, it's actually 154%, so 10 times more than what he was allowed to do under perfect conditions. So clearly the campaign had zero effect and it did not achieve the single purpose for which it was created, namely preventing the major real estate companies from destroying China's housing market. Now you might ask, how was Evergrande still able to secure funds if they were no longer allowed to? Well, this is where the magic banking tricks come into play, better known as shadow banking. Because the wonderful executives of Evergrande simply sought out new ways to get a hold of funds, and they did this in 3 main ways. Trust loans, those perfect money laundering vehicles, wealth management products, always part of a healthy bankrupting breakfast, and last but not least, commercial paper, which is literally a homemade IOU that you have to pay back in the short term, often just 1 year. Now at first glance, you might look at these 3 financial instruments and say, well, they're all perfectly legal, so what's so bad about doing this? There's nothing nefarious going on. And to that I say, yes, it's all sort of legal if you do it correctly, but the problem here is not legality, it is solvency. Before we continue, please drop a like and subscribe to the channel since it really helps us out a lot and it's free. The only reason why Evergrande's executives were using these methods was to secure way more funds than they could responsibly borrow. If they had tried to secure the full 300 billion only through major banks, it would have never worked. These bank managers would have taken one look at the books and said, fuck off, you're not getting a single penny. But in the world of shadow banking, there's no regulation and there's no oversight. So it becomes virtually impossible to correctly assess a company's ability to pay for all of those loans. Take commercial paper for instance. These are unsecured loans, which is perfect for Evergrande because all of their assets in their possession were already used to secure other loans, so they needed a way to borrow money without putting up any more collateral. On top of that, Evergrande also engaged in trust loans, which makes it even more difficult to assess their ability to pay, since these are also outside of the normal banking system. So by this point, Evergrande was basically playing high-stage Jenga with the company by borrowing far more than they could handle and just shovel the debt around every time the regulators wanted to look inside. Now you might ask, why did Evergrande need so much money all the time? What were they doing with it? Well, the simple answer was, they actually didn't. Evergrande initially did not need any of the money they were borrowing. However, they got so obsessed with maintaining an unrealistic growth rate, which caused them to keep buying up more and more land, building expensive apartments on it, and then simply sell them off at a very low margin. After they completed the transaction, they would run right back to the bank for more money so they could do it all over again. The focus wasn't on getting the best price for each project, it was on simply generating as many projects as possible. Now the funniest thing about this whole fiasco is that the company actually blames the media for their current position. Evergrande actually came out with a statement on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange saying, the recent negative reporting on the company have dampened the sales of their real estate projects. So you borrowing $300 billion is the fault of the media being mean to you? Is that it? Okay, I get that, because when I feel sad, I go to Mackie D's, and when they feel sad, they borrow $300 billion. Now the sad thing here is that even though their explanation and handling of the situation is already pretty sad, it's also going to hurt many businesses and families all across the nation. Because Evergrande employs over 200,000 people, but they hire far more every year to complete their development projects. In a single year, the company hires well over 3.8 million individuals that will be out of a job and will put a huge stress on the Chinese job market. So the executives were not just gambling with the investors' funds, they were also gambling away millions of people's lives and livelihoods. Not to mention that on most of these projects, as is common with developing property, the home buyers have to put up a certain amount of money before the house is even built. Currently, many of these projects are on hold, and it's going to be a long time before it's clear if any of these will ever be finished. So not only will these people lose their down payment, but they will probably also lose their house. And this is just the beginning, since this problem stretches far into the local banking system. Evergrande used well over 128 banks to finance a major part of their debt, and these banks are not only at risk from just bad loans from Evergrande, they now have to check which other companies that they have given loans to can still make their payments if they don't get paid. So in June of this year, the Chinese regulators under the direction of the Stability and Development Committee stress tested a number of important banks to see what their exposure to Evergrande was. Naturally, this reporting was denied by Evergrande, and not only that, they also claimed that everything was fine and they would meet one of the 3 red lines by the end of June. Well, that sounds great, right? With the emphasis on sounds, because everyone knew they were lying and that they were in dire need of cash. At this time, Evergrande was trying to unload as many assets as they could so that they could make the interest payments on the gigantic debt. But there's an obvious problem when holding the equivalent of a garage sale in the midst of a giant disaster. Every single company that you try to sell to knows how bad you are hurting. They know that you need to sell, but they don't need to buy. So they're going to lowball you all day long, meaning that even if you get a deal done, it's going to be a terrible one and you have to sell way more assets to get hold on enough funds. These deals normally take months to finalize and to get the money wired, but at the time, Evergrande did not have months. They were already defaulting on some of the payments to smaller companies, even though they were still claiming that no defaults had occurred. This was a stupid and obvious lie, since local governments in various provinces had already frozen their projects and activities until payments were made. During this whole catastrophe, the shares of Evergrande began falling faster and faster, and the company desperately tried to get friends to buy them and prop up the share price. You know, just like any other successful company does all the time. Now this is something that Evergrande has actually done in the past, so they thought they could easily do it again, but judging from the magnificent nosedive that the share price took, I would say that not many friends had bought in, or it had little to no effect. So by this time, Evergrande finally began to realize that maybe, just maybe, this plane is going to crash and that they might need to get some help and stop pretending everything is fine. So naturally they hired Houlihan, Lokey and Admiralty Harbor Capital, which is a very experienced company in these matters. And Evergrande said they would be tasked with assessing the group's capital structure. Now obviously I was not privy to these meetings or evaluations, but if I had to guess, they took one look at these books and said, "You're f***ed." Because at this point, even the geniuses at Fitch and Moody's, you know, the guys that practically blew up the financial system in 2008, yep, those wonderful gentlemen, they started downgrading Evergrande's credit rating. And if you know anything about rating agencies and their ability, or more precisely their willingness to grade debt, it is that you practically have to beg them to give you a downgrade. So you can rest assured that the creditworthiness of Evergrande was terrible long before the downgrade, and that perhaps if there was a more robust and truthful credit rating system, these guys would have never gotten their hands on $300 billion worth of debt. Sadly, it's just another case of corporate greed gone wrong, and a lot of innocent families are going to be left holding the bag. Some people might have saved up for years to buy their first home, and that future has been wiped out. Because even if Beijing finds a way to save this whole mess, it's going to take a long time to sort everything out, and it will definitely not be enough to compensate every single person that was hurt by this. Not to mention that I'm sure there's an even bigger idiot out there that's ready to create the next disaster. I mean, we all saw Bill Wang could not even hold on to his title for more than 6 months. This was the Evergrande financial scandal. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more videos.